If you love the great game of rugby, this podcast will have you fully engaged as the world's biggest rugby names share their stories, their moments when mindset, mental toughness, and mental strength either made them or broke them.
On the mark. On the mark. On the mark. On the mark.
I'm Mark Zimmerman, and I'll be your host, and I cannot wait to go on this rugby journey with you. All right, welcome to the show, everyone. And I have to say, this is an episode I have been looking forward to recording for a long, long time. And very shortly, you will find out why. Our guest today on the show is an international rugby icon for many, many reasons. Dallen Stanford, welcome to the show. How are you? Where are you? And what are you up to these days?
Well, firstly, Zim, it's great to be here. We've spoken to each other for quite a while now, and we made it happen, which is brilliant. I am in sunny Los Angeles, California. Even though I grew up in Cape Town, South Africa, I came here in 2003 as a holiday and never left. What am I doing? Still working in commentary, which is great. Did a lot this past year in Major League Rugby, Super Rugby Americas, the Sevens World Series, and then currently working on some 10s actually here in California, which is pretty good. So a whole mixture of 7s, 15s, 10s, and then also working with Perry Baker on Flag Rugby X. So it's kind of a full immersive rugby career. I just love the sport, as you can tell.
Wow, that was a lot to unpack. So let's just dive a little bit deeper into that. And I guess for the benefit of our audience, can you give us a brief rundown of where your rugby career started and how you actually got to be in the USA and on the broadcasting side of things?
Yes. So I grew up in South Africa, obsessed with rugby as a young kid, a young child, as we all were or are. And my formative years were spent at Rondebosch Boys High School, and I also came through the junior school. I got a chance to learn, from brilliant coaches at Rondebosch. And then I played at University of Cape Town at UCT, the Ike Tigers, in the under-20s and eventually the first team. So many beautiful memories on and off the field there. So many great friends I made. And then after I finished my marketing degree and about 25 years of age, I left South Africa to come for a holiday. And that's kind of where, I said, things change. And I met my wife at the Springbok Bar and Grill in Los Angeles. So it was weird because, it was so weird because rugby was my obsession. I went there to initially get some work and employment while I was still figuring out what to do and play a bit of rugby in the US on a 6-month holiday. And we ended up dating and got very serious very soon. And a couple of years later, we actually got married. And so my journey changed. I was going to go back to South Africa and look for work and, continue on a rugby journey there. But in the end, I was playing rugby here. My rugby coach said, "Hey, Dallen, I want to invite you to try it for the USA Sevens team." And I said, "Well, listen, that's great, but, I'm not an American citizen." He goes, "Well, you recently got married. You played here for, at that point, it was 3 seasons, I think it was." And so, completely changed. I ended up playing sevens for the USA for 3 years on the World Series. And then I transferred, because I always studied marketing and advertising. I was very keen on the media side of things. And so after playing, I got a chance to work in media. And then someone said to me, "Dallen, you love talking about rugby. You work in media. Why don't you become a rugby commentator?" And I said, "Oh, I didn't even know you could be a commentator. Well, how does that even work?" And it so happened that at the rugby club I was at, one guy is a rugby producer. And he said, "Dallen, I want you to come and try it out, see how it goes." I loved it. And I've never looked back. That was, 13 years ago.
Oh, my goodness. That is an incredible backstory. And thanks for sharing it with us. So really, you've been in the USA, you've been in North America for the past 20 years. And I know, as many of our listeners will know, you've had various impacts on growing the game of rugby. And you mentioned Flag X. What's Flag X, and what can you tell us about your prior ventures? And actually, more particularly, you mentioned the legend Perry Baker. What can you tell us about?
Yes. So let me first start with the other avenues of rugby. So I mentioned to you how obsessed I was with rugby. So my father always said to me, he said, "Dallen, you love rugby. That's great. And you would ideally like to play for the Springboks, down the line." He said, "But listen, if those things don't happen, what are you going to fall back on? What work are you going to do? Like, what are you interested in?" And so it was kind of interesting because I was passionate about advertising, marketing. But on the rugby side of things, there's so many different careers, which now people do normally. But back then, it wasn't really an option. So, but coaching is something I really enjoyed and loved, and particularly working with young people. And so when I was in the US, I got a chance to coach a university team here, Occidental College nearby. And that was a very cool experience because I was blessed to have so many great mentors growing up and so many great teachers and coaches So it's very cool for me to use the best bits from every single coach and, channel out the things that I loved and then put that into, my new coaching philosophy, if you will, but obviously it's theirs. And so that was very cool to be able to give back in that kind of way. It actually led to me then, on the coaching side, then working with one of the best organizations out here called Play Rugby USA. So they're a nonprofit. They work primarily with inner city kids and they use rugby as a vehicle for social change. And coming from South Africa, as we know, like people look up to the national sports teams, particularly the Springboks, particularly how diverse the team is. And the team is representative of the country, which I think is so beautiful. And, looking at obviously 95, I was a young teenager during that time period. Madiba, was somebody that I looked up to going, wow, how did this person come out of prison, forgive everybody and lead a united South Africa and use rugby as well as sport, which traditionally wasn't, something for non-white South Africans. So that inspired me, as a young kid always. So when I got an opportunity here now in the US to coach and work with young inner city kids, I was so lucky and blessed that rugby was that vehicle and that tool. And we got a chance. I led the LA program. We started with 6 schools and they don't know rugby here. Rugby's very new. Obviously heightened success now because of the Olympic Games, but this is, about 20 years ago. So using the game of rugby, people were apprehensive and they're like, oh, but rugby's dangerous. And I said, no, we're going to do non-contact flag rugby. So then all of a sudden the parents were put at ease. The kids loved the game because everybody was involved. It's co-ed as well. So everybody can play safely. The girls could dominate and sidestep the boys. And it was a great uplifting tool, for them as well as their development. So that was just an ultimate program to be involved in as well. We grew that program from 6 schools to 125 schools in Los Angeles, 5,000 young girls and boys playing the game, who then, by the way, would go on to play rugby at different clubs. And a lot of those kids actually applied for scholarships. And so their life trajectory changed just from the sport of rugby. And so how blessed am I to be able to introduce something new to those kids through Play Rugby USA? As I said, just a remarkable program. But as I was, getting on in trying to make a difference here in the US, something that we definitely noticed was that the greatest impact you can make, I think, is helping a coach. If you can upskill a rugby coach, their impact in their community and their reach is going to be tremendous. So I was lucky enough to partner with the British Council. They had a nonprofit here in the US called Friends of British Council. And we worked with Premiership Rugby in the UK. And what we did is we sent a group of 20 to 30 coaches on multiple different trips to Premiership Rugby to work with 3 Premiership teams. So these regular coaches, whether they're coaching youth, high school, university, or club level here from America, men and women coaches, they got a chance to go across to immerse themselves for a week in Premiership Rugby and get access to the top coaches, the top minds, and stay in touch with them as well. And then at the same time, they took the level 300, which I think it's called level 3 World Rugby course as well. So that was a fascinating program. We had 100 coaches from about 40 different US states all get a chance to experience that over a few years and bring that back to the US to then increase the level here in America, which I think was one of the best programs, that we've got a chance to be a part of. And then last, you talked about Flag Rugby X. It's called Tag X around the world. We call it Flag X because flag football is very popular here as well, being the Olympics in 28. But 4 years ago, a group actually out of Australia contacted me and said, listen, we have an interesting game we think you may want to be involved in. And I said, okay, well, what is different about your game? Then I found out there's kicking involved, which, being a backline player, I love kicking and being able to chip kick in the game of touch, but we were never allowed to do that, right? It wasn't a skill you could use. Yeah. So the great thing about this game is you can kick whatever you want on attack. It is 7 attackers against 6 defenders on the field. So it's interesting because you've got an overlap built in all times. But if you kick and the ball goes out, even if it rolls out, the attacking team then goes down to defend, and you defend with 5 players against their attacking of 7. So all of a sudden, there's some high risk, high reward at stake. There's a different scoring mechanism. So when you get over the try line, there are 3 different parts where you could score for differing values. And those values are linked to a fantasy online table so that players can be ranked globally around the world. So someone's playing socially here in Los Angeles, I could rank myself with somebody in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, England, wherever they are playing around the globe, which is kind of cool. And there's money and prizes on the line as well there too. So I had all these fun little elements. But the biggest thing for me is that actually rugby clubs can use Flag X as a fundraising tool. So they can host tournaments wherever they are in the world. We send them a free equipment bag. We train them online, or if you can get them in person. And Perry Baker's one of our ambassadors. So any rugby club in the world can use this to attract alumni back to the game safely, or new players that are maybe apprehensive about trying the game in the tackle format so they can play non-contact. So the game ticks all those different boxes. So we're very excited to launch here in North America and beyond.
That actually sounds incredible. And everything you've just shared with us, I think our listeners were holding on to every word, because it's a fascinating journey you've been on. And to be involved in those ventures, especially what you were saying about the 100 coaches from all those different states going over to the UK and learning from some of the world's best rugby coaches, I think that is a very powerful way for USA rugby to grow across the women and the men's game. In fact, one of the previous guests we've had on the show was Naya Tapper, who was talking just about how incredible it's been. She's been in the game for a while, and for her to have seen how it's ramped up in terms of its growth and its professionalism. And that's just, marries up with what you were just sharing with us. That's incredible, Dallen, honestly. So, but also what's interesting, we touched on the importance of getting access to coaches from different levels of experience in different countries. As you know, I'm purely focused as a coach on the mental side of the game and mindset, mental skills coaching. Who do you think is getting it right out there? Who's focusing enough on the mindset and the mental side of the game in terms of, teams who are out there, and who probably should be looking to pay more attention to that, should we say?
Yes, that's a great question. I would say everybody needs to pay more attention to mindset, to mental skills as well. It's something, in my era growing up, there wasn't a lot of attention on that. And it was, if you did have some good coaches or good teachers at school, or your parents and things like that, they helped you with some of that. But in today's age, it's a completely different setup. Obviously, we have social media. We have accessibility, which generally is perceived as a good thing, but also is a negative thing. So even myself as a commentator, nobody knows who I am in terms of I'm not a professional player or anything. But if I commentate a game and, you make a small mistake or something, people will go online and say, oh, this commentator got that name wrong or did this. I unfortunately had one during the Rugby World Cup last year where Marnie Lebok, brilliant no-look kick, obviously, and I accidentally ID'd, and I know Curtly Aronson really well. I've called him on the sevens, but for a second, I called him Chesn Colby. Both had scrum caps on, obviously both playing on the edges of the field. Simple mistake, but people then would badger people online. Now, I would imagine being a professional rugby player, and let's say, you drop the ball when scoring or something happens, off the field as well. These things, the keyboard warriors out there don't let it down. I think it's very harmful to referees, very harmful to anybody involved in the game. It doesn't matter if you're just a professional player. So I feel like there are organizations that are doing a great job. Like Loose Heads is a great organization that are really trying to put mental health first at the forefront. Because I also think I grew up in an era where we didn't necessarily share our feelings openly. We didn't talk about things too much, and those lead to issues, right? But I feel like these days, professional teams now are understanding it a bit better. I'm not going to pinpoint, countries or teams who are doing it well, but those that are doing it well will allow their players the freedom to be able to be a bit more relaxed in their setting, in their profession. It's such a high pressure job. Any professional sports person, right? You've got to think about, they're trying to look after their families, their careers. There's so many negative things as well. We just may see the highlights at some times, right? When a player is winning or a team's doing really well. But it's a tough job in the mental side of things. The physical side of things is hard enough as it is, but then you have to balance it all together. So you're right. I love that you're doing a podcast like this, shedding light on mindset and growth mindset. I think is something very important. We're talking about their Play Rugby USA program. One thing I wanted to touch on was what a good job they did. And Mark Griffin was actually from the UK. He ended up playing rugby for America. He's a fascinating story as well. He did a lot of research in, how do we, at the young ages, how do we help young kids in situations, in practical real life situations, overcome a bit of anxiety and also give them the tools to cope with certain things? So I love the formula, and it really is very simple. It was, we would go to schools and introduce flag rugby, and then we invite them to come and play in mini tournaments. At these mini tournaments, they would play, let's say, 6 flag rugby games, small games. They would experience winning, they would experience losing, every single team. Rarely a team would win every game, right? But it was interesting because when you were in that little group with those players, they took this one loss like they'd lost the Rugby World Cup final. Now, these are kids that are 10 years old. So it's important to be there in that situation as a mentor and explain to them, this is part of life. This is the great thing about life. Now we have another chance. We have another game coming up in 20 minutes. Don't worry about this one. Let's flush that one. Couple things we're going to work on are here. So just those small adjustments without a program like that, for example, helping young kids, unfortunately, I did see other teachers, right, from the local schools that didn't quite go through the same training that we were luckily given. And they'd be shouting at the referee. So the kids embodied that behavior. They became highly upset when the coach became upset. So you can see the patterns and you can see the behaviors. So I do feel like, as you're pointing out, if we have people who understand mental health just a little bit and are able to help us with those tools, especially as younger people, we'll be better citizens and obviously better people later in life as well.
That's so true, and that resonates very powerfully with me. And most of our listeners, I think, who know Dallen Stanford, the name, would have heard you and seen you broadcasting through the World Cup and various events around the world. But what can you share with us, Dallen, about your professional playing days? Was there a time or a moment that you can reflect on where you needed to tap into your own mental strength or a particular mental skill or tool that you needed to use?
Yes, I would. I have an example, I think, where I thought about it the other day in the training environment, right? So our setup was slightly different. Our professionals, US setup back then, we would live in our home states, and about 2 weeks before a World Sevens series stop, let's say we're going to, South Africa or Dubai, we would meet at Chula Vista in the Olympic Training Center, and we would train with 20 players, of which we knew 12 were going to be selected. So it was a pretty hectic, intense battle for those 12 spots. And literally the last 12 players standing would then go on the tour and represent your country and have this unbelievable experience. But before we even got there, we obviously had to be a certain level in our fitness testing, which were pretty intense. We had a high level scores we had to get and all sorts of things. And I remember in our home states, we would be training by ourselves. And so that's mentally tough, right? When you've got this unbelievable event coming up and you hope to make the team, but you need to get yourself there. And I remember going out of the track, and one of the drills was you had to run 100 meters in 20 seconds. Okay, so that's not bad. You're not sprinting, you're getting there at a decent speed. And then you rest for 40 seconds. And then, rest for 40 seconds so the minute goes up. Then you do 200 meters in 40 seconds. So now it's a little harder because you're going a bit further, 200 meters. But you only have 20 seconds to rest now because the minute is coming up. And then you do it again 40 times around the track. Okay, so that's a lot because you think about it, the most you're resting for is 40 seconds, but that's after you've run at 200 meters and you already have another 100 meters under your belt there. So, but I remember my mental state would waver, and I said to myself, listen, nobody's watching. You're here by yourself. You can just give up. You can just walk off and nobody will know. But I remember thinking to myself, okay, what is the outcome? What do I really want to do? Okay, do I really want to make this team? If I do, I need to be all in, and I need to go as far as I can fitness wise. And so that's kind of, I would say, mental strength is tough because it's easy for me then for my mind's telling me, hey, just stop, just go ahead and give up. But I knew my goal, my dreams, obviously to achieve those, I had to do these steps. So for me, it was focusing on just the next 200 meters or just the next 100 meters. Just do that and then see how I feel after that. All right, I feel okay, let me keep going. As opposed to saying, okay, I've got to do 40 laps. Now I have 39 to go. That's a big number. Maybe that's a bit too much. So I think focusing on the small one step at a time approach was something that certainly helped me as well.
And it sounds to me like your inner athlete, the voice of your internal kind of dialogue with yourself would have played an important part there, because quite often we listen to the negative voice in our head that tells us we're not good or we're not good enough at something, and often I will challenge athletes and I'll say, well, if you can hear that negative voice, try imagine you pick up the remote control for that voice, you just mute it. And then pick up the other remote control and you unmute the positive voice that's going to encourage you to keep going. The voice that fuels resilience and all of those other powerful things that high performance athletes need. So that's great. And Dallen, obviously, we'll just step out of the rugby space for a moment. Moving from Southern Africa to the USA, traveling the amount you've traveled, setting up a home life in a different country. What would our listeners benefit from hearing an example of where mental skills have played a part in your personal life away from rugby?
Yeah, I would say it's interesting because it's a situation we talk about mindset and being positive as well. I would say I was very fortunate in growing up with two unbelievable parents. My mom and dad were wonderful role models and examples. My mom's resilience was something that I've always saw in her. She actually was in the Guinness Book of Records. I think it was like the Southern Africa edition, but she set a record. How's this? Non-stop tennis with 3 other guys when she was at Stellenbosch University. I want to say it was like 28 hours of non-stop play. They were allowed 5 minutes every hour to get water, but they played every other time through that. It was, something as a young kid growing up. I saw the photo in the Guinness Book of Records, like that's amazing. So you can see that, the mindset, right, of persevering as you're going through. So that was always instilled in me. And so, when I met my wife and she's like, wow, she said, I asked her like, why, obviously there are certain things we love about each other, obviously, but she said to me, something that stood out to her was that how is this person come from a country so far away? It's like a 30-hour journey and is able to pick up and make a life here, type thing. That takes a different mindset. Because again, I obviously missed my family. I still miss my friends and things like that. But I think in all, you need to look, I look at the world in a very positive way. There are obviously a lot of negative things in the world, but I think the way you see the world is what you get back, right? And so how you are with people, how you interact with them, even in any work or situation, if you always see the positive and you don't have the expectations, you obviously need to do the work. I think that's vital. You need to do your homework. And as a commentator or rugby player, I would do the most homework I can because that's a way to prepare. But if you don't expect certain outcomes, you won't be disappointed by them. And if something does come through that is great, then you can celebrate that. So you're always in a mindset or a mind frame of celebration and working hard, but knowing there are great things that are coming through. And if something doesn't happen, no worries. You've got other huge opportunities that are coming through. So overall, I would say with that attitude, that helped me to create opportunities and to be open, I think, to any opportunity. Even if they were, when I started out, I took a lot of non-paying jobs to get experience in the industry and to work and make connections. And obviously, all those connections, I was myself authentically kind to people. And so it was really nice because later when opportunities arose, they thought of me and were like, hey, Dallen, we know you're hardworking in commentary, come try this. And here's an opportunity. And so that happened in multiple areas. And so, if you are generally, being a good person in life, like I love helping people. And that's amazing because I'm not doing it because they're going to help me back later. But it is cool because once you put that positive energy out there, you do get it back, plentiful.
And Dallen, that's testimony to your character. I mean, that the part of the reason we're even having this conversation is because you very kindly responded to a message when I reached out to you. There was something you were you were inspiring a nation through your commentary, and I felt compelled to reach out to you. And so it certainly is true. You are very generous with your time. But I'm curious, you obviously your parents are huge role models for you and played a huge part in carving out your your character. In stepping back into rugby circles now, was there a particular coach or a player or someone outside of your immediate family that played the role of a mentor or inspired you or gave you guidance?
That's a good question. I have huge respect for anybody in the coaching role because, most of the coaches do it just because they love this sport and they want to help out as well. My favorite coaches were coaches that instilled discipline and respect and hard work, but at the same time, were able to be humorous about it and have a laugh as well. And so those characteristics I really bonded with, and there were teachers too like that at Rondebosch that I really admired and things like that. But I think looking back overall in all of that, again, we talk about the parents. One example I do remember from my mom, in fact, it was interesting. So while she was so resilient and amazing and this ultimate athlete, and she played to a late age in life, she would get very nervous. She was a teacher. She taught Afrikaans at Herschel and a few other schools. She would get very nervous when it came to the end of year marking for her grade papers. And so I said to her, listen, why do you get nervous about this? Because you've done it before successfully. And she said, yes, no, I was the top 3 marker at, So okay. So, and it's interesting because me as a little kid, I was learning obviously through you parents, but the lesson was so profound because I said to her, okay, you've got experience in it. So generally when somebody does something for the first time, let's say you're public speaking or you do something for the first time, anything you do, you're going to be nervous because you've never done it before. But once you have the experience and you have success at it, then it should be okay, right? And so she never, it's something that it took a little while for her to work on, but I learned from her in that example going, okay, I need to learn from my mom here because everything that I do, if I've done it once before, then I should not be nervous and I should be okay and have that mindset going, it's going to be okay. And because stress, I think, is a big a big thing. A lot of people, anxiety, a lot of people deal with. It is something that is not easy. And again, it's easy for me to tell people, hey, don't be stressed. But no, you actually need to work through it. And so I think, going through that as a young kid, that really helped shape me, I would say, to be more positive at things and to look at the outcome going, well, hold on, if it's something new, sure, let's be cautious about it. But once you've done it once, you should be able to roll with it,
Absolutely. Wow. I mean, and Dallen, most high performance or professional sporting environments, and I'll take it a step further, not even in the professional context, in the competitive context. So club rugby, first 15 school or college rugby, there's always going to be players arriving who are new into the mix. So the fresh recruits, talented but inexperienced. And then you're going to get players nearing the end of their journey. That milestone, 150 caps or coming towards their last season. What different advice would you give to each player coming in for the first time into national call-up and the player looking at his last game or last season? How different would the messaging be when it comes to mindset and mental skills?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question because, I think when it comes to the end of someone's career, let's start with that one. That's a very tough transition. And I think it's harder than a lot of people realize that aren't in it and don't know about it. It's not dissimilar to, in the US, as an example, the American football players that tend to retire and they have a lot of money at first and then everything gets blown away because they're living to a lifestyle that they think they should be accustomed to. I would say in our rugby, rugby people are more accessible as well, which I think is great. But I think it's looking to the future in developing skills outside of the game. What excites you? What are your passions? What are your interests? I think that's an important place to start. My father was very big with that to me. And he said, listen, Dallen, he said, and he was an accountant. And I don't necessarily think, he liked numbers for sure, but maybe it wasn't his dream job in total, if you think about it. But back then it's a different era. He had to provide for his family and things like that. But when I was a young kid, I said to myself, I don't want to be behind a desk. It's something I saw my dad do. Not that he loved it. Let me do what I like. And he said, you can find something that you love. And that's interesting because rugby obviously didn't have a lot of opportunities back then. But the players today have a lot more opportunities to work in something around the sport if they like the sport. So my biggest advice would be to make connections, to get into something in industries that you like while you're playing. So when there's an opportunity, even if it's volunteering or linking up with organizations or brands or things like that, that's a good way to transition successfully into something else that you enjoy. Because once the lights go off and you're not playing in front of 50,000 stadiums, and you're not necessarily earning that sort of money doing what you love, there is a very dark period that can happen. And if you don't have the skills to cope with that, whether, like we said, it's mental skills, or if you can transition to something that you like, that transition is a lot easier. So Perry Baker's a good example. He's somebody that played for 10 years in the Sevens World Series. He just announced his retirement. And he's doing rugby, which is great. He's coaching with the USA Sevens team, assistant coach, and he's working with us at Flag X. So he's still out and about in the community, still doing rugby. He loves it. You can see him smiling. And that is a great transition. If it was a different setup, let's say he had to go to a desk job and be a sales rep for another company, I doubt he would be happy and be smiling and invigorated by that every day. So that's number one, I think, for a player retiring. And also, by the way, have fun and really enjoy those moments. Don't put pressure on yourself. I think that is something for both examples of a young player coming in. There is going to be a self-imposed pressure, a tremendous amount of pressure. And I want to touch on pressure because you did ask me about, somebody else I forgot to mention. There was an assistant coach, a skills coach, actually, that came to work with us, mental skills, called Kevin Sinibaldi. Our head coach at the Sevens, Al Caravelli, thought that it was a wise idea at the time. We were all very new in the professional rugby environment. Some people like Todd Clever were very experienced. They'd played in Super Rugby and internationally for 15s for many years, but a lot of us were newer. So we were, in our first year on the Sevens World Series, we would play teams very close, and in the last few minutes, we would give up a try and lose the game. Now, that was kind of a pattern. And as you know, winning's a habit, but so is something like that. And it was the mental side of things where we would just switch off for the last little bit, but also we put ourselves under pressure knowing, hold on, this is too good to be true. We're up against South Africa. There is 2 minutes to go. They're going to score here. And then we imploded and they would score. So the mental skills coach was very good, and he worked with he used a formula that worked with successful baseball teams here and things like that, who were talented players, but their mindsets just were slightly off. And what I mean by that is, if we made a mistake individually, we would dwell on that mistake, and then it would haunt us a little bit during the game. And it's a common thing, and it's hard not to do. But what he taught us, which I thought was very valuable, and I loved it at the time, and I still use it to this day. He said, listen, there should be something you'll be able to do to wash away that error, to not think about it. And he used the example of flushing a toilet. And he said, listen, let's just flush that mistake. So let's say I drop the ball and it's the next, flush it. And you can physically make a motion of flushing it while you're on the rugby field if you want to. And then let's just focus on the very next task. That's all. Don't worry about the score, don't worry about the time. What is your personal job? And for me, I was playing scrum off at the time in sevens. It was, to attack the other scrum off if they got the ball. And that was it. That was my only thing to focus on. And it really helped us. It really worked because we weren't looking at the bigger picture. We weren't stressing out about the time, what was required. It was, what is my task in the next moment? And everybody was doing that, whether you made the mistake or not. But everybody would flush it and would focus on. So you wouldn't badger a player either. You wouldn't say, you need to catch that ball. It was none of that. It was all positive talk and flushing mistake. And so from that point of view, just talking about the first time player, I think that's a vital thing is, we've got so many wonderful international sports players that come onto the field, and the best ones are the ones that, number one, are taking risks, which I think is great. I think if you're a young player, all that anxiety tends you to be, a bit more conservative, but just be yourself, because that's why you were there. It's why you were brought into the team. It's why you're there. Trust the people around you and just focus on your micro tasks that you are going to do in the game, for example. And the last thing I'll say is also try enjoy the moments, because these are very special moments and special times. One never knows when that's taken away from you, through whatever happens in one's life. So I think those are some of the best bits of advice that I've received that have worked for me over the time.
And I think any player emerging or coming to the end of their playing journey who's just listened to what you've just had to say will be able to take at least one or two absolute nuggets of gold away from that, because what you say is 100% correct. I think so. So thanks for sharing that. And when you mention ventures outside of the rugby, whether it be a business venture or a side hustle, something caught my eye on social media this week, actually, Dallen, and it's about something that you've been up to with a bunch of high-profile rugby names from around the world. What would you like to share with us on that front? You know what I'm talking about, don't you?
Yes, I do. Avant Cape Brandy. All right. So this is an interesting one. So I mentioned to you my interest when I was a young kid, when I was studying, was marketing and advertising. Well, one of the things which is always interesting is rugby brands, right? And what's out there. So interesting enough, a friend from Rondebosch Boys High School reached out to me and he said, Dallen, we're putting together an alcohol brand. It'll be a Cape Brandy out of, Southern Africa. And we will have a bunch of legendary rugby players aligned from around the world with this brand. And not dissimilar to, there are a lot of actors, obviously, that have famous tequila brands, George Clooney and all of them. Yes. I said, this is a wonderful concept. I love the idea. And I said, great, why are you calling me? And he said, listen, Dallen, he said, well, you're traveling the world, you're commentating all these players. You also live in America, which is a great market as well for this down the line. He goes, you can connect us with a lot of great people. He goes, and you can talk about it whenever you get a chance on air or when you're around the world. I said, very happy to. So the people involved, by the way, what a great group. We've got Rugby World Cup winners in John Smith. We've got Scott Fritz, Lucanio Makazole Mapimpi, Jean de Villiers, Raymond Rule, Joseph Dwebe, Butch James. I've got a story for you later about Butch James. CJ Stander from Ireland, George Gregan from Australia, Jim Hamilton, Via Pennell from Scotland, Justin Marshall from New Zealand, and Wasali Suri from Fiji. Plus, we're looking at a few other folks as well in the rugby community. So the venture is fantastic. So it's in South Africa, available at most places you can buy alcohol, the Avant Brandy, and then we're going to be looking at the UK next, and then eventually to the USA as markets, of course, where the brand gets out to. Also, the goal, the brand is to use some proceeds and go back into the game, particularly at the grassroots level, help different communities through the sport and through people's connections. But I think it's great because, as you know, especially when your rugby days are over, it's nothing better than meeting up with rugby folks, having a drink, watching a game, getting together, and you can do that with the Avant Cape brand.
I absolutely love that story, and I'm sure there is so much more that will be to come from this group of entrepreneurs, ex-rugby players. I would imagine your tasting evenings, if you all get together at the same time, would be good for a laugh as well.
Absolutely. The stories people can tell. Now, I'm going to quickly touch on one story. You talk about Butch James. So Butch won't remember this, but there were many years ago where Butch and Bobby Skinstad and a few other players were getting ready for the Rugby World Cup. And I want to say this was 2003 Rugby World Cup. And they were gearing up. They were coming back from injury. And part of their rehabilitation process was to play a couple of games, minor games. So they played at UCT, where we're there. One time I go to training in the evening, and they said, by the way, they're going to be like 5 or 6 Springboks scattered in the team. But they didn't rescatter them. They just put them in the B side, and they played against our side, the A side. And Butch James was lining up opposite me, and he put a chip over the top. And all I remember was looking up to try and collect the ball. I was nowhere near catching it, and he smoked me like he does.
Yeah,
and
that's Butch.
Yeah, so I woke up a few minutes later, thanks to Butch James. And so,
well, hopefully the brandy will have some kind of knockout effect on him one of these days, and you can have your revenge.
Well said.
So that's great, and I think that's an inspiring story, because I know that some of the Australians and Kiwis that obviously in my neck of the woods here, who are former players, they've got wine labels, and they've gone into various other joint ventures. So it's great that you're doing it. And I think anyone listening to this should realize that there's so many options for life outside of rugby, whilst you can still do it even with your rugby mates. That's one of the takeaways there. The game in the USA obviously is going through a massive growth phase. There's exciting times ahead. There's a Rugby World Cup in 2032. There's the LA Games in 28. How are you involved in that? Is it still too early to be doing anything on that front, or what's going on in the USA in preparation for those two massive events?
Yes, so it is a big growth period in America, and a lot of that is to do with the USA Women's Sevens team and Alona Mars, rise to being a global and household name here. She's appearing currently as we speak on Dancing with the Stars network television show here with millions of votes for her. She's just a wonderful ambassador, and I think what's interesting is a lot of people in America didn't know about rugby before the Olympic Games, and in 2016 and in 2020 Tokyo. Me as an American, sports fan and American rugby fan and rugby fan in general, I thought, okay, if the US man or woman can get a medal here at one of these two Olympic Games, more people know about the sport and start talking about it and that sort of thing. Because the average person, when you mention the word rugby, they're just like, oh, is that the game with pads, the dangerous game? And they will stay there. They know the All Black haka. Those are the two things people say, and that's it. They don't know anything else. They don't even know America as a team. So after the US woman won that bronze medal, and in dramatic style as well, my wife, who's not connected outside of me to the rugby world, she's an actor, she's not in theatre, she teaches a couple of universities. People would say to her, just out the blue, not knowing that she's married to a former rugby player or current commentator, say, do you know Alona Mars? This person's amazing. And then my wife, Verity, would say, yes, I met her. And they're like, oh, Alona Mars, they were blown away. But also the fact that they were talking about rugby was amazing for our sport. So we're in an unbelievable phase where there is now money being unlocked in the game. And I think that was the key part here, where I know when I played, we were paid $100 a day as a professional sevens player for your country. Now, again, this was in the early days of professional for the US Sevens program. And so a lot of that has obviously changed. There's endorsement deals now, and there's bigger brands getting involved. But a lot more American companies are now seeing the women's side of the game. There's Women's Rugby World Cups, and we'll be hosting it here soon, as well as you mentioned, the Olympic Games as well. So all that is going to have such a positive effect. Number one, on growing the playing numbers. I think that's a key area. Growing up in South Africa, most people played rugby or had an opportunity to play very where here it's a very much a fringe sport. That is slowly changing. There are more and more youth programs. There are more and more school programs, like I mentioned, not just to play rugby, but there's one through Major League Rugby called Imagine Rugby, and that also is going into schools, introducing flag rugby to PE teachers and growing the game through current players who come and coach as well. So there's a lot of work done at the lower levels. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, how do you determine how is that going to impact at the highest level, which is hard, right? Because your national team generally is deemed your way of success. If you don't, if you don't win a World Cup, let's say you're one of the top nations, you are not deemed as a successful rugby playing team that year, let's say, or the 4-year cycle. And that's hard, right? Because so much goes into improving a national team. And the gap, as you and I know, between the top 10 countries and the next level of countries is drastic. There's a 60, 70 point difference, sometimes even in the top 10 side. So, with the US men and the US women, they're top 6 in the world, which is fantastic. So they have a much better chance, obviously, of again getting into semi-finals, and progressing beyond. Where the men's side didn't qualify for the last World Cup, which was very tough on the country's players, and of course everybody involved in the game, particularly the fans, because they want to go to France, they wanted to watch an American team play or a Canadian team play, and for the first time they couldn't see either. So that did set back the US and North America in general. But with the Canadian side as well, winning a silver medal at the Olympic Games, that has galvanized their community as well. So the grassroots level is growing tremendously. There's more money in the sport. The governing body, which by the way was bankrupt a few years ago, so I must say that up front, which is tough, right? Because they have a big task. The US is unlike many other countries in that it's so vast. There's time zone differences between the East Coast and West Coast, which is a 6-hour flight. Now, in Australia is massive as well, but again, these are big cities. These are New York and LA, big hubs. If we had to play, like I remember playing in tournaments where we would travel to the East Coast and we would lose the game because it was a 3-hour time difference. We were playing an 8 a.m. game, which was 5 in the morning for us, So these distances and the expense and travel are tremendous as well. So with all that said, though, the national coaches now for the women's and the men's obviously have a good strategic plan in place. They're obviously working with World Rugby as well, because World Rugby wants US to be a strong team at the World Cups that we host, obviously. So it starts with the next one for the women next year, 2025, and in 2027 for the men. So the coaches are in place, great coaches are involved. There also are more US coaches linked to the national teams, which I think is good. You and I spoke about the coaching development. Generally, the US would hire a foreign coach, which I think is tough because you need somebody that understands the American landscape and the American game. So pairing somebody with an international experienced coach is important, and they're finally doing that now, which I think is good. So there are a lot of positives on the way. Major League Rugby as well on the men's side of things is certainly growing. While it experiences some ups and downs, every now and again a team folds and things like that, there's still huge amount of interest. They've released record broadcast numbers for this past season, record attendance numbers, which is fantastic. And then there's going to be a professional 15-a-side women's league starting soon as well for the first time ever.
Wow.
So that I think is magic to happen in our era.
Absolutely. And I guess the question on many people's minds who are following the emerging growth of rugby in the USA is how much of a genuine threat would the USA men's and women's teams be by the time we get to, let's say, 2032, the men's team. Like, has the USA got the capability between now and then to establish themselves as a formidable force, not just as a tier 2 nation, but beating tier 1 nations? We saw Japan beat the Springboks in a World Cup in Brighton when that was on. Can we expect something of a surprise from the USA?
Now, that's a very, very tricky question. Japan is the best example you brought up. Number one, they had that remarkable win against the Springboks, but then they backed it up in their own World Cup, making the quarterfinals and beating teams that you would expect they would never have beaten before, which is tremendous. So if we look at that trajectory, what Japan did really well, I would say, is that their professional top league that they had in Japan, which had been going for well over a decade at the time, what I loved about their setup was they limited the number of foreign international players who could play on each team. Unfortunately, Major League Rugby has not done that and has not decreased the number. Wow. So some teams can field up to 12 international players on a Major League Rugby team. I know that number hopefully will reduce next season, but at the moment, this is what it currently was. So a lot of people are in favor of that number going down, like Japan had done, and which is why they developed a lot of their local players with a few international players. So saying that, can the US men's team be successful? Number one, I would say the 27 Rugby World Cup, the team needs to at least take part. And this is the sad part. The US hasn't won a game at a Rugby World Cup since 2011. I was there at the 2011 Rugby World Cup as a media manager for Team USA, and the US beat Russia. So think about that, right? That's only one game. Where at the level you're talking about, they would need to go to a World Cup, win maybe 1 or 2 games, and then the next World Cup be in a better spot, maybe to win 2 or 3. Yeah. And then, my answer is final spot that they're looking to go for, I don't think is attainable unless a lot changes in the next 8 years. But again, that is the goal, I would say, for hosting in 2031. And it is a goal that could be achieved if more investment comes in, more people are exposed to the game. Because I think the biggest threat to other nations when they look at America is they look at America's sporting prowess in football and other sports. And they say, hold on, if a tenth of those players who don't make it go and switch to rugby and get some experience and play the game, or at least know the game at a younger age, and then let's say they don't make an NFL team or they don't, go do another sport, that's when the US side will be the most dangerous. And that is true, but that is obviously going to take a long runway, a long time. And I think, with a woman's success, that's starting to open the gate and open the doors as well. Now, for the women's side, I'll say completely different. The US woman made a semi-final in recent times at the Rugby World Cup in 15s. I would say the women's side now, again, of course, we know how strong England is. We know how strong New Zealand is. I would say a semi-final is very realistic, and you never know what happens in those knockout games. So my money is when the US hosts the Women's World Cup in 2033, it would be amazing to see the US Eagles in the final for that one.
That would be incredible, not just for the country, but I think for the game in general, to see emerging countries become more dominant. And I think the mindset and then the whole... everything that encapsulates mental strength and belief would be contained in that winning outcome. Dallen, before we wrap things up, just tell our listeners a little bit about the Rugby Hive, which is your own podcast. What's that about? How do we tune into it, and how did that come to be?
Yes, the Rugby Hive actually was a project during the pandemic time period where everyone had a lot of time on their hands. And we weren't sure what to do. I'd been meaning to do a podcast for many years, but the technical side of it kind of stumped me initially. And then I kind of got over myself and said, okay, let me just record something. A friend of mine reached out to me, Robin McDowell, a Canadian international sevens player that I played against during my time. He was coaching, still coaching at a high level. He coached in Mexico. He worked with Canada. He's worked all over the world as well. So he said, listen, I know a lot of coaches around the world. You know a lot of the players still. You obviously a lot of broadcasters and things like that. Why don't we team up, do a podcast together? We'll call it, we came up with different names. The Rugby Hive was something like it brings people together, not dissimilar to a hive, and we're hardworking and that sort of thing as well. So it was really interesting for us to tell stories of rugby people that we knew. And a lot of these people were higher profile names. So Brian Abana was one of our first guests that came on, our absolute legend. And we've had a lot of players and commentators and coaches and things like that spanning the different eras, whether they're currently playing or retired. So I think the Hive is just another a nice podcast to listen to if you are interested in different people from around the globe and hearing their stories. Our motto is every legend has a story, and we're here to tell it. And people can find us obviously on the socials at the Rugby Hive. And then we did a short one last year called the Rugby Sevens roller coaster, which is a bit more focused on sevens and a bit more focused on the Premier Rugby Sevens, which is going to actually have an event coming up next month, which is great. But they're the first professional sevens league in the US. And so you're talking about exciting times. I think sevens is something where a country like the USA, a country like Canada has been very successful. Let's be fair. The US were number 2 in the world in the men's series in 2019. The women as well have achieved great heights, winning tournaments here and there, producing unbelievable players. So I think sevens is actually a game that a lot more easy, as we said. You can beat sides ranked above you as well. Anyway, so those two podcasts just touch on a bit about sevens as well.
Thanks for sharing it with us, Dallen. And I have to say, because of Australia's location on the planet, time zone wise, often it's a lonely 2 a.m. or 1 a.m. Viewing time for us to be watching internationals, and it's your voice that echoes through our house at that 1 a.m. time. So we joke in Australia, it's normally the voice of cricket, throughout the summer. Well, we have the voice of Dallen coming through our speakers. And just before we wrap it up then, so if anyone in Australia wanted to purchase the brandy, where do we buy it?
Yeah, it's coming soon. So they're definitely working on international distribution rights and things like that. Okay. And yeah, so we'll keep you posted. That's for sure. And what we'll do is obviously people that do travel. And let's say you and I end up in the next World Cup together. Obviously, we'll sneak a bottle in my suitcase so we can sample on the road.
100%. I'm going to hold you to that. Absolutely. And so, Dallen, honestly, thanks so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure having you. And we're going to call this for the first time, because hopefully there'll be a second and third time on the show. We certainly learn a lot from you. We certainly enjoy listening to you. So thank you for your time. And for our listeners, If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to just press the follow, like, and share. The more of these messages that get out to the global rugby community, I'm sure it helps people along their journeys as well. Thank you very much for listening. And this has been On the Mark, all things rugby, life, and mindset. Thank you very much, Dallen, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Zim.
You've been listening to On the Mark, all things rugby, life, and mental skills. This podcast is brought to you by the MPT method, Mindset, Performance, and Team, a coaching tool and a coaching framework designed to help coaches and players bring out the absolute best in their performance, both on and off the field. Join us and follow us as we continue to bring you the world's great names in coaching and players across the rugby spectrum.